Karen thought she could do whatever she wanted without consequences, until she pushed my disabled son into the pool. What didn't she know? I'm a sergeant, and it wasn't going to stay that way. Want to know how this story ends? Watch to the end. Living in a community with a residents' association has always been a headache. Everyone has heard those stories about controlling neighbors, absurd rules and fines for ridiculous things, like leaving the garbage out 5 minutes after the right time. But I never imagined that one day I would have to deal with someone who crossed all the boundaries of insanity. And that's exactly what happened when this woman came into our lives. I'm a sergeant, and I've learned to deal with all kinds of absurd situations throughout my career. Disobedient soldiers, chaotic missions, even situations where staying calm was a matter of life and death. But none of these experiences prepared me for a rowdy neighbor who thought she could do whatever she wanted without suffering any consequences. The HOA was a problem in itself. Every week they made up a new rule, and it seemed that this particular woman made a point of overseeing every little detail, as if she were the neighborhood sheriff. She wasn't the president of the HOA, but she acted like it, always with that little notebook in her hand, always ready to complain about something ridiculous. My grass was a centimeter over the limit? Fine. My wife's car parked on the street for more than 2 hours? Fine. My son, only 10 years old, playing on the sidewalk with a colored chalk? That devalues the neighborhood, she said. But none of this prepared me for the day she did something unforgivable. My son is a wheelchair user. He was born with a condition that affected his mobility, but this has never stopped him from living life with joy. He loves being outdoors, playing with other children, and, above all, swimming. He always liked the community pool, where he could feel free in the water without needing a wheelchair, but apparently that was a problem for this woman. The community pool was theoretically open to all, but the HOA loved to impose arbitrary rules, and she, as the volunteer inspector, always had a way of making other people's lives a living hell. That day, my son and I went to the pool to enjoy some time together. He was wearing a special life jacket, and I always stayed close by to make sure he was safe. But as soon as we arrived, the woman appeared. She was sitting on a sun lounger, with those giant sunglasses that only the most insufferable people wear, holding a glass of some drink that was probably too strong for such an early hour. Her gaze immediately landed on my son. I knew there was trouble coming. She stood up, straightened her blouse as if she was about to give a big speech, and marched towards us with the air of someone who thought she was about to save the world from great danger. "Children with special devices can't use the pool," she said, crossing her arms and trying to sound important. I was already tired of her, tired of the absurd rules, the arrogance, the way she looked at people as if she owned the street. "There is no such rule," I replied firmly. She snorted. "Of course there is. It's in the rules." Except it wasn't. I knew the rules very well, and they didn't say anything about disabled children not being able to swim. But this woman didn't care about real rules. She wanted everything to work her way, and anything that didn't fit into her perfect worldview was a problem. But that day, she went too far. As I reached for my cell phone to show her the rules and put an end to that ridiculous argument, she simply reached out and pushed my son straight into the pool. Yes, without warning. No reason, just pushed. Time seemed to slow down. My son fell into the water with a great splash, his arms flailing in sheer panic. He knew how to swim, but he hadn't expected to be thrown like that, without preparation. The vest kept him afloat, but the shock of the moment sent him into despair. My heart raced. Instinct spoke louder. In less than a second, I was jumping into the water to rescue him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. I held him tightly, making sure he was okay, and took him to the edge of the pool. Some people around were already standing, trying to understand what had just happened, and it was at that moment that I looked at the woman. She was still standing there, with her arms crossed, with a satisfied smile on her face. "Maybe now you'll understand that this pool is no place for him," she said, as if she had just been taught an important lesson. That's when I knew. She hadn't just done something cruel. She had made a mistake that she would never forget. My blood boiled. My hands gripped the edge of the pool so hard that I almost broke the concrete. She didn't know who I was, but she was about to find out. My heart was still racing. The sound of the water splashing around, my son's frightened look, that woman's contemptuous laugh. It all blended together in my head like a blur. But one thing was very clear to me. This woman had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. I pulled my son out of the pool, holding him tightly, feeling his body still shaking from the shock. He wasn't crying, but his eyes were wide with sheer panic, as if his mind was still trying to process what had just happened. And that woman? She was still there. Not a hint of remorse on her face. No show of regret. Just an expression of superiority, as if she had done something necessary to correct a problem that only existed in her head. I clenched my fists. Breathe. That's what I forced myself to do, because everything inside me was screaming at me to solve it the way I knew how, the way I had learned through discipline, training, and experience in situations that required quick responses. But this wasn't a mission. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a residential neighborhood, a community swimming pool, and a woman who clearly thought she was above everyone and everything. You just pushed my son into the water. My voice came out firmly, without even having to shout. She rolled her eyes. He was in the way. That's all she said. I felt a warmth rise in my chest, a mixture of fury and disbelief. What she had just done wasn't an incident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional. It was an act of pure evil. The surrounding noise began to grow. Other residents were standing around now, some with their cell phones in hand, others just watching from afar, trying to figure out whether they should intervene or not. But I had already decided what I was going to do. I got up, put my son on my lap, and started walking. Not towards her, as much as I wanted to, but away from the pool area. I was going to make sure my son was safe before I sorted it out. What about her? She laughed. Are you going to run away, little soldier? That was the last straw. I stopped in the middle of the road. I turned around slowly, feeling every muscle in my body begging me to take action right then and there. But no, I had something better planned. Something she would never forget. I'm not leaving without making sure you pay for what you've just done. Her voice came out low, precise. No room for argument. She opened her mouth to reply, but for the first time, she seemed to hesitate. Something in my posture must have warned her that the situation had changed. I was no longer just any father. I was a sergeant, and a sergeant knows how to deal with a threat. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. Police department? Yes. I need to report an attack on a child. It was at that moment that she lost her pose. The smile disappeared from her face, replaced by a confused grimace, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. You're kidding, right? Her voice came out shaky. Do you think I look like I'm joking? She looked around, as if expecting someone to come to her defense. But there was no one. The people around were murmuring, some recording, others just watching in silence. There were no allies there, no gossipy neighbors to justify her absurd attitude, no other HOA members to back her up. She was alone. And, for the first time, she seemed to realize it. I continued the call, describing the situation in detail. The operator listened intently, asking questions about my son's condition, about witnesses, about the exact location of the incident. Yes, I have witnesses. Yes, there are security cameras in the pool area. Her face turned pale. Yes, she'd forgotten about the cameras. The HOA loved to keep an eye on the residents for any little thing, so there were cameras all over the community, especially in the common areas. And now, those same cameras that she used to keep an eye on other people's lives were going to prove that she was guilty. I ended the call, aware that the police were already on their way. You can't be serious, she tried to laugh, but her voice failed her. You assaulted a child. That's a crime. The words came out heavy, like lead. She took a step back. For the first time, her eyes seemed to reflect an emotion other than arrogance. Perhaps she was finally understanding the gravity of the situation. But still, like anyone incapable of owning up to their mistakes, she tried to argue. I was just protecting the pool. He was going to dirty the water. There was a collective sigh from the people around him. Not even those who wanted to avoid confusion could defend that woman anymore. Looking at the faces around me, I saw expressions of disgust, shock, and indignation. People who, until then, had just ignored her, now saw what she really was. And then the police siren echoed in the distance, the sound of a final decision. She turned to run, as if there was still a chance of escaping. But there wasn't. The police car stopped at the entrance to the pool area, and 2 officers got out. One of them already had a notepad in his hand, ready to hear what had happened. What about the woman? She froze in place. This time, there was no fine she could issue, no made-up rule she could cite, no neighbors to intimidate. She had made a mistake, and now she was going to pay for it. The sound of the siren still echoed in the air when the car finally stopped. The woman looked around, as if looking for a way out, but there was nowhere to run. The crowd that had formed around her didn't show a shred of sympathy. The policeman's posture was neutral, but I knew how to recognize when someone was already judging the situation before even hearing the details. And honestly, who could blame them? An adult woman throwing a wheelchair-bound child into the pool was not something that went unnoticed. The tallest officer, a middle-aged man with a serious look on his face, walked up to me first. "Are you the one who made the call?" I nodded, keeping my son firmly by my side. He was still shaking a little, but I was beginning to understand that he was now safe. Yes, this woman, I pointed directly at her, without beating around the bush, pushed my son into the pool without any warning or legitimate reason. The policeman looked at the woman, who opened her mouth as if to retort, but he held up a hand, telling her to wait. She closed her mouth immediately, her shoulders tense. "Do you have cameras in the area?" he asked. "Yes, there, and there." I pointed to the security posts around the pool. The policeman's expression didn't change, but I saw in his eyes that this solved half the case. No, it was an accident, or he slipped. Everything was recorded. The second officer, a woman with her hair up in a tight bun, turned to the woman. "Ma'am, what's your name?" She crossed her arms, trying to regain her pose, but it was too late. "I don't see why that's necessary," she muttered, rolling her eyes. The policewoman sighed, picked up the radio on her shoulder, and announced something I couldn't understand, but the tone was not one of patience. "Ma'am, I'm asking for your name. If you refuse to cooperate, we can take you into custody until we can formally identify you." That made something click in her head. If there was one thing these people feared more than anything, it was losing control of the situation. Until that moment, she still thought she could get away with a speech or an empty threat. But now she was dealing with real authorities, not a group of neighbors she could intimidate with a fake ticket. She swallowed. Karen White. If there was a prize for the most predictable name, she would have won. The policeman wrote down the name and asked a few more quick questions, the kind of questions that, for anyone in their right mind, were already a sign that things were heading down a path of no return. She remained impassive at first, but when she heard that the cameras would be checked, her facade began to crack. "Look, this is an exaggeration," she tried to argue, her voice rising a notch. "That child shouldn't be in the pool. I did everyone here a favor." The policeman raised an eyebrow, jotting her words down on his notepad. "A favor?" She blinked a few times, as if she had only just realized what she had said. But it was too late. The surrounding crowd murmured audibly. Someone let out a nervous laugh. Someone else shook their head in total disbelief. "Me?" I just crossed my arms and waited, because that was the difference between us. She thought she could win by shouting. I knew that patience was the best weapon. "Let's take a look at the camera footage, just to confirm everything," said the policeman. I could see the woman cringe a little, because the truth was that she knew what she had done. and she knew that, this time, there was no way out. One of the HOA employees, a short man who looked uncomfortable being there, came up to the officers with a tablet in his hand. He stammered a little, clearly nervous, before showing the recording, and there it was. The video started with me and my son arriving at the pool. He was excited, as always, while I organized his things. Then the woman appeared. The video had no sound, but you could clearly see her pointing, gesturing, and then that push. Dry, cold, without hesitation. My son going into the water. Me jumping in after him. The public court was formed. The trial already had a verdict. The policeman watched the recording to the end, then looked up at the woman. "Madam, turn around." The color drained from her face. "What? You're being arrested on charges of assaulting a minor and endangering the life of an incapacitated person. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to find an argument, but no words came out. The surrounding crowd moved away, making room for the police to do their job. When the handcuffs were put on, a small collective "oh" was heard. It wasn't often that someone who had spent her life feeling untouchable was finally treated like any other criminal. She struggled a little, but it was no use. The police escorted her to the car, while she muttered insults, talking about suing everyone and putting an end to this second-rate neighborhood. But nobody cared what she said anymore. The only thing that mattered was that, for the first time, the real rules had been applied to her. I held my son's hand and looked at him. He still looked a little shaken, but when our eyes met, I saw something different there. He saw justice being done. And, at the end of the day, that was worth more than any revenge. The woman was led away in handcuffs, wailing and cursing, but no one paid any attention to her anymore. The HOA, which had previously seemed to protect her crazy antics, now ignored her as if they didn't know her. When the car doors closed, the surrounding crowd finally began to disperse, but I stood there for a while longer, watching. Not because I wanted to see the dramatic outcome, that was already guaranteed, but because I wanted to make sure that my son saw it, that he knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that people can't just get away with something so cruel. He looked at me and smiled, and at that moment, nothing else mattered. But as we drove home, the sense of closure I had hoped for didn't quite come. I knew it wouldn't end with a simple arrest. People like her didn't disappear so easily. They came back, tried to turn the tables in their favor, played the victim when they were confronted with the consequences of their actions, and I was right, because, just a few hours later, my phone started exploding with messages. The HOA messaging group, which was usually a den of pointless complaints and arguments about the color allowed for garage doors, was now boiling over. Apparently, the woman had been released on bail and was already in "I'm the real victim" mode. She was furious. She said that she had been publicly humiliated, that no one defended her, that this neighborhood was trash, and that it was all just a big injustice against her. Oh, and of course, she swore revenge. She said she was going to sue me, the HOA, the police, the mayor's office, the manufacturer of the handcuffs. In short, anyone who was even remotely involved in the fact that she was treated like any other criminal. The problem? Nobody believed her anymore, because the video had already been leaked, and it was everywhere. Someone, probably one of the neighbors who recorded everything, had posted the video online. Not just the moment of the arrest, but also the recording from the security cameras, clearly showing the moment she pushed my son into the pool. And the internet. Well, the internet is unforgiving. The comments ranged from pure shock to vile jokes about the villain of the year. Her name started circulating on social networks, and the whole neighborhood became the center of attention because of it. She wanted control, but now she had the wrong kind of attention. And worst of all, its own arrogance was its undoing. After a few hours of virtual chaos, the HOA did what nobody expected. they published an official statement, and in it, they announced that the woman was officially banned from the association. This meant that not only would she lose any influence she had over the rules of the neighborhood, but she would also have to pay accumulated fines for all the infractions she had committed over the years. She had always loved handing out fines. Now it was her turn to pay. The messaging group turned into a real show of celebration. Neighbors who had previously been afraid to speak out against her were now speaking out, sharing stories of the petty tyrannies she had imposed over the years, talking about how she fined children for leaving bicycles on the sidewalk, how she spied on other people's houses, how she made it hell for anyone who didn't follow her crazy rules. It was like watching an empire crumble in real time. And me? I just watched from afar, satisfied, because I didn't have to lift a finger. She dug her own grave, and now she was falling right into it. Only, as expected, she wasn't going to fall in without a little more screaming. The next day, a letter arrived at my house, a crumpled envelope unceremoniously delivered with predictable contents. It was a summons. She really was trying to sue me. The charge? Moral damages for exposing her publicly and causing emotional distress. I laughed. She caused her own scandal. She threw a wheelchair-bound child into the pool. She was filmed. She practically admitted the crime in front of the police. And she still wanted to say that I was to blame? That was a whole new level of delusional. But okay, if she wanted a fight in court, I was ready. And I knew that this would be her last move, because after that, there would be nothing left for her to cling to. The subpoena was there, lying on my desk, as a reminder that this woman just didn't know when to give up. She really thought she could sue me for moral damages after pushing my wheelchair-bound son into the pool. The audacity was almost admirable, if it wasn't completely ridiculous. But fine, if she wanted to play that game, I was ready to win. I had enough experience to know that sometimes people don't just fall in. They cling on to the last crumbs of power they have, trying to find a way out, an excuse, anything that will make them look less guilty. And this woman? She was desperate. The trial was scheduled for a few weeks later, enough time for my lawyer to gather all the necessary evidence and ensure that this circus had the outcome it deserved. But while I was waiting, a curious thing happened. The woman began to disappear. Not literally, of course, but the version of her who loved to be in the spotlight, who patrolled the neighborhood like a condo jailer, who handed out fines and threats as if she were the sheriff of the street, that disappeared. Now she hardly left the house, and when she did, she avoided eye contact with anyone, because she knew. Everyone knew. Her scandal had become too big to ignore. She was no longer the powerful woman who dictated the rules of the neighborhood. She was the local joke. Her name became synonymous with shame. When the day of the trial finally arrived, I already knew that victory was guaranteed. My lawyer prepared for the worst, but deep down we all knew that there wasn't much that could be done to defend her. The evidence was clear. The videos were everywhere. The witnesses were willing to testify. But what about her? Well, she arrived in court without her usual arrogance, without the impeccable clothes she wore to appear superior to others, without the upright posture of someone who thinks she's always right. She seemed smaller. She was no longer the same woman who felt untouchable. She was just someone who knew she had already lost. When the judge started analyzing the evidence, it didn't take long for her case to completely fall apart. My lawyer presented the videos, the depositions, the text messages in the HOA group, where she threatened to sue half the world. Each new piece of evidence was a blow to the fragile wall she tried to build around herself. And then came the moment that sealed her fate. The judge looked at her and asked, "Madam, did you deliberately push a wheelchair-bound child into the pool?" The court was silent. It was her last chance to show a shred of regret, to admit her mistake, to try to minimize the damage she had done to her life. But no, she couldn't. She took a deep breath, clenched her fists, and said, in the most arrogant voice she could muster, "I only did what was right." The judge let out a heavy sigh. I almost felt sorry for her. I almost did. But then I remembered my son's panicked look in the water, and any trace of compassion vanished. The verdict was quick and to the point. The lawsuit she had filed against me was dismissed on the spot, without even needing to be debated. What's more, the judge ruled that she should pay me compensation for the damage caused. It wasn't a small amount. It was enough to make any idea of revenge that she had left die right then and there. But it didn't end there, because while all this was going on, the HOA decided to deal the final blow. She was officially expelled from the community, and with that, she was forced to sell the house. A few weeks later, I saw a moving truck stopped in front of her house. She stood there, giving hurried orders to the movers, avoiding eye contact with any neighbors. No one came to say goodbye. No one wished her luck. Nobody cared where she went. She spent years making everyone's life hell, thinking she was superior, thinking she was untouchable. And in the end, she ended up alone. She got in her car, slammed the door, and drove off. No applause, no tears, without anything. And just like that, the Queen of Chaos was dethroned, and peace finally returned to the neighborhood. And if you like this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like.